Mark stepped outside with his morning coffee and nearly tripped over a bright orange envelope taped to Uncle Ray's front step. The steam from his mug curled into the brisk November air, and for a moment he just stood there, staring down at the envelope as if it might be something else, a coupon, maybe, or a church newsletter. But the color was too official. Too aggressive. He crouched, picked it up, and turned it over. No stamp. Just bold black letters on the front, notice of violation. Yesterday, a neighbor had commented as they raked leaves across the street, that porch might have seen better days, but so has half this town. It was meant kindly, even with a touch of affection. But this wasn't kindness. Inside, Ray sat at the kitchen table in his old flannel shirt, spreading apple jelly over toast with the quiet precision of someone who didn't rush mornings. The radio hummed softly in the background, something from the 70s, and a black and white photograph of a younger Ray in uniform rested near the windowsill, framed in worn oak. Mark handed him the envelope. Ray didn't flinch. He opened it with a butter knife, read it once, folded it in half, and placed it beside his plate like it was a bill for tires he hadn't ordered. $500 fine, Mark said, still standing. Visual noncompliance? Ray sipped his coffee. Just another letter. Mark slid into the chair across from him. For what? The paint? The porch? Ray shrugged. Probably both. Doesn't blend well with all the new solar roofs and smart siding. The silence hung like a screen door left open in a storm. The smell of toast and hot coffee filled the space between them. You gonna do anything about it? Ray reached for the jelly again. Nope. Around 10, Karen Whitmore showed up, all pastel knitwear and perfect posture, carrying a clipboard like it was an accessory. Her knock was a polite 3-tap rhythm, the kind that expected obedience. Good morning, she chirped when Mark opened the door. I was just doing my usual community walkthrough and thought I'd stop in. Ray appeared behind Mark with his limp subtle but present, leaning slightly to his right. Karen's smile tightened. Mr. Bell, always good to see you, she said, eyes not quite meeting his. I hope you received the compliance notice. We're just doing our part to keep Willow Hills beautiful. Mark gestured toward the front steps. Is that why it was taped to the porch? Karen's laugh was high and light. Our volunteer noticed a few, let's say, visual inconsistencies. Nothing personal, of course. Your home has a certain historic charm. Ray nodded once, just enough to be courteous but not agreeable. Karen turned, scanning the street like a general reviewing troops. We're preparing for the Veterans Day Parade. City Council's doing press. We want the neighborhood to reflect our shared values. Pride. Order. Harmony. From the side yard, Ethan waved from atop a milk crate. He was working on sanding a block of pine with the kind of dedication only 10-year-olds and hobbyists possessed. Karen's eyes flicked in his direction, then back to the house. Of course, she added, voice now syrupy, we wouldn't want the parade route to pass by an unkempt property. Ray didn't respond. But Mark saw the faintest twitch in his jaw, there and gone in a blink. Well, Karen smiled again, I'll let you gentlemen enjoy your morning. Let us know if you'd like help choosing an approved paint color. We've got samples. She tapped her clipboard. Page 17. She left with a wave that didn't wait for one in return. Later that afternoon, Ethan appeared on the porch with a paper sack and 2 sets of goggles too big for his face. Mr. Ray, I brought my hammer and some glue. Can we start the birdhouse? Ray nodded and pulled 2 stools from inside. Let's give it a shot, but only if you promise not to glue your fingers together like last time. I only did that once, Ethan grinned. Mark watched from the doorway, the way the boy leaned into Ray's instructions, how Ray softened just a bit when explaining how to notch the roof corners. There was something quiet and sacred about the moment, a bridge spanning generations, built from cedar scraps and trust. As the sun sank behind the oaks lining Willow Street, long shadows reached across the lawn. Mark walked out to collect the mail and saw something new pinned to the mailbox, a clipboard with laminated paper flapping gently in the breeze. At the top, in all caps. HOA notice, pending review. 2 days later, the same orange envelope returned, this time marked final warning. It was affixed to the mailbox this time, tucked beneath the red flag like some kind of grim decoration. Mark plucked it loose and turned it over with a sigh. The print was bolder now, as if yelling louder made it more legitimate. Ray didn't say much when Mark handed it to him. He stood on the porch in his boots and a flannel shirt that had seen decades of winters. The cold was gentler today, but the clouds were gathering. He slit the envelope with a thumb and scanned the contents, jaw working as he read. Railings too low now, Mark said, reading over his shoulder. And paints inconsistent with approved palette. He paused. That a thing? Ray folded the notice and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. That porch has held longer than she has. Inside, Ray stirred oatmeal in a saucepan, slicing half a banana with the practiced rhythm of someone who didn't care much for novelty. His black coffee sat untouched on the counter, steam rising and curling in the light. Mark leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching his uncle move around the kitchen like nothing had changed. At May's place, the regulars filled the booths like they had for years, maybe decades. The checkerboard floor was clean enough to eat off of, and the smell of sizzling bacon tangled with the tang of fresh brewed coffee. A wall behind the counter displayed framed photos of local veterans, some in uniform, others in fishing hats or Sunday suits. Lisa poured Mark's coffee without asking, placing it gently in front of him. "Oatmeal combo?" she asked. He nodded. "Same for him," he added, nodding at Ray, who was still outside smoking, a rare habit these days. Lisa leaned closer. "They did the same to the Millers," she murmured. "Drove Em out just before Christmas. Said their window shutters were too colonial or something. That house had been in the family since Eisenhower." Mark frowned. "What happened?" Lisa refilled a sugar caddy slowly. "Offered to repaint, then rewire, then rebuild. All community approved, of course. Just not affordable. They left. Nobody talks about it." A rustle from the back booth caught Mark's eye. An older man in a green bomber jacket, silver hair curling at the ears, turned a page of his newspaper without looking up. Lisa followed his gaze. "That's Walter," she said quietly. "Been here since Truman. Knows more than he says." Midway through their meal, Mark's phone buzzed. Unknown number. Mark Bell speaking. The voice on the other end was syrupy and firm. "Hi there, Mr. Bell. This is Dana from the Willow Hills HOA liaison team. We noticed your property's pending review and wanted to offer help connecting you with one of our community-approved contractors. We can schedule an estimate, no obligation." Mark glanced at Ray, who dipped his spoon in the oatmeal and seemed wholly uninterested. "Is this optional?" Mark asked. "Well, we do recommend working with vendors familiar with our visual standards," Dana replied, still cheerful. "I'll get back to you," he said and hung up. That evening, Ethan showed up with his backpack and a half-finished birdhouse. His cheeks were red from the cold, but his grin was warm. "Mr. Ray," he said, "I think I figured out the roof part." Ray smiled and took the birdhouse, turning it over in his hands. "You're getting the hang of this." From a cardboard box beneath the porch swing, Ray pulled something wrapped in a red bandana. He unfolded it carefully and revealed a small carved eagle, wings spread, eyes sharp, tail slightly chipped. "Here," he said, placing it in Ethan's hands. "For when you finish your first one." Ethan beamed. "Thanks. Can I bring my little sister next time? She wants to learn the whittling too." Ray nodded. "If she promises not to use glue on the dog like you did." As Ethan left, Mark helped Ray bring in the tools and blankets. In the front closet, he reached for a coat and knocked loose an old shoebox, taped and retaped over the years. It hit the floor with a soft thump. Inside, beneath some faded receipts and a broken wristwatch, lay a medal in a velvet case, the Silver Star. Mark lifted it gently. He brought it into the kitchen where Ray was washing his hands. You have this, and you're letting Karen shame you over peeling paint? Ray dried his hands slowly, not meeting Mark's eyes. Because it doesn't change how folks treat you. There was a long pause before Mark returned the medal to the box and slid it under the sink cabinet. Ray poured himself a glass of water and drank it like it had a purpose. They didn't say much after that. Later that night, as Mark dropped a few bills on the table at May's place, Lisa stopped him and slid a folded napkin under his hand. It was warm from her palm. Ask Walter about Willow Creek Phase 1, she said quietly. He remembers what happened there. Walter Harlan didn't speak until his coffee cooled. Then he slid a manila folder across the diner table without looking up. The folder made a dry shuffling sound on the formica surface, its corners frayed and curling slightly. Mark hesitated, one hand still wrapped around his mug, the other resting open beside a half-eaten piece of cornbread. The diner was half empty, morning light streaking through the windows and casting long beams across the checkered floor. Outside, frost clung to the edges of mailboxes. Mark opened the folder and tilted it toward the window. The papers were yellowed copies, printed emails, and scanned HOA notices, each stamped in red or underlined in fading pen. He scanned the first few. $300 for mailbox non-uniformity, Mark read aloud. $200 for ornamental gnome obstruction. And here's another, non-regulation flag mount angle. Seriously? Walter finally looked up, his eyes pale and direct. They're all dated within the first 10 days of November. 3 years running. Mark flipped a few more pages. The pattern became clear: timing, language, escalation. All of it leading up to Veterans Day. Why now? Mark asked. Walter shrugged, sipping slowly. Visibility. HOA wants everything pristine before the city's attention turns toward the neighborhood. The Millers, the Harrisons, Jim Collins, vets, all of them got fined out of their homes. Nobody thought to question it because the paperwork looked clean. Mark looked up, his brow creased. Karen did this? Walter leaned back in the booth. Karen's clever. She files for state veteran supportive community grants every fall. Gets money to improve conditions, but then uses that money to pressure the actual veterans off the properties. Replaces them with compliant buyers who don't ask questions. The bell above the diner door jingled faintly. A man in overalls walked in and nodded at Lisa, who was already pouring his usual. The smell of hash browns drifted over from the griddle. She's funding it all through the HOA, Walter continued. Then padding the application with fluff, flags, banners, a community mural. All while dismantling the people the grant is supposed to support. Mark ran a hand over his jaw. That's fraud. Walter's tone didn't rise. Not if no one challenges it. Ray appeared at the table a few minutes later, leaning his cane against the booth. He greeted Walter with a nod, and Walter returned it with a quiet, "Ray. I remember you from the town hall," Ray said. Walter nodded again. "I remember the sound of your voice from the back row." Mark handed Ray one of the notices from the folder. "She's been running the same playbook for years." Ray adjusted his reading glasses, eyes scanning. He didn't say anything, but his mouth formed a tight, familiar line. Walter reached under the table and pulled out a second folder. This one was thicker. There's a legal path. ADA protections. Historical exemptions. If we start the process now, the review board will have to freeze any demolition plans until it's processed. And what are the odds? Mark asked. Walter offered a small smile. Better than silence. From his coat pocket, Walter produced a faded photograph. It showed Karen, dressed in her HOA blazer, shaking hands with a senator in front of a poster that read, "State Model HOA President 2020. She beamed at the camera, one hand raised mid-gesture, as if already mid-speech. "She's made herself untouchable through performance," Walter said. "But she's sloppy. And she underestimates paper trails." The three men sat in silence for a moment, each of them focused on something different, Ray on the photo, Mark on the folder, Walter on the window. Outside, a group of kids passed by on scooters, their laughter sharp in the morning air. The wind rustled the pine trees behind the diner, and a gust set the chimes ringing gently above the door. "You're saying she's using the grant money to clean out the community?" Mark said at last. Walter took a breath. "Your uncle deserves more than a parade. He deserves the truth to stand with him." The folder remained between them, heavy with its quiet weight. Later that afternoon, Mark returned home to find Ethan crouched on the porch steps, working a small chisel against a block of wood. A few curly shavings had gathered around his feet. "Careful with that blade," Mark said, stepping onto the porch. Ethan looked up. "My dad says they're gonna tear down the porch soon. He heard it from the HOA guy." Mark paused, then sat beside him. The air smelled of pine and dust and the faint scent of smoke from someone's chimney. "You hear that from Karen?" Ethan shrugged. "No. From Mr. Finch. He fixes gutters. Said there's talk about removing non-compliant structures." He squinted at his carving. "This count?" Mark didn't answer. He watched the boy work until the sky turned a deeper shade of blue. That evening, Mark knocked on Ray's door and handed him another folder, this one sealed and labeled in Walter's neat handwriting. Ray looked at it, then at Mark. "Who's Clay Mason?" Mark asked. Ray's face didn't change. He took the folder, held it for a long moment. "Brigadier General," he said at last. "He commanded me. He still owes me." Karen's voice echoed in the community center, "We're not here to shame anyone, just to align expectations." The room smelled faintly of lemon-scented floor cleaner and distant anxiety. Beige carpet muffled hesitant footsteps. Folding chairs were set in neat rows, but only about 2/3 were occupied. A plastic table stood against one wall with untouched lemonade in a glass pitcher and a tray of sugar cookies no one had dared to take. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed with the persistence of bureaucracy. Mark sat near the middle, next to Ray and Walter. Ray's hands rested on his knees, fingers steady. Walter had brought a notepad but hadn't written a word yet. A flag hung behind the podium, just to the left of a poster board listing the HOA's 5 Pillars of Harmony in bold script. Karen stood beneath it like she belonged to the wall more than the neighborhood, gesturing with practiced ease. She wore a tailored navy blazer and a necklace that caught the light when she turned. "We're all here today because we love Willow Hills," she said brightly. "We believe in pride of place. In beauty, order, and tradition." Mark leaned toward Walter and muttered, "She left out control." Karen pulled out a packet from a folder and held it up. "As part of our annual pre-holiday assessment, we've completed visual reviews of all properties along the parade route." She didn't have to say whose house that included. Karen flipped to the first page, her tone warm, almost congratulatory. "Some properties simply need a little love, new paint, uniform railing height, consistent lattice design. Others, unfortunately, do not yet reflect the values we've all agreed to uphold." Mark stood. "And who decides what consistent means? There's nothing about lattice design in the charter." Karen gave a tight smile. "Mark, thank you for that. I'm sure the board would be happy to clarify that during our next revisions." Walter raised his hand, then his voice. "Per Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, modifications for accessibility override cosmetic standards. Mr. Bell's railing and porch structure meet ADA specifications for his use." A few people in the room shifted in their seats. One man scratched at his scalp. Another adjusted his hearing aid, the quiet squeal of feedback breaking the silence. Karen clasped her hands in front of her. "That's all well and good, but this is a private organization. While we respect federal guidelines, Willow Hills has its own standards. And we believe that visible harmony is just as important as physical accessibility." No one spoke. Mark looked over at Ray, who had not moved, not once, since the meeting began. Karen continued, flipping to another tab in her folder. "We even offered assistance, approved contractors, funding incentives. But non-compliance persists. It's unfortunate but necessary to ensure progress. The room remained silent. Then Ray stood. It took him a moment. He braced his cane against the chair and used the other hand to reach into his coat pocket. The fabric rustled. Karen tilted her head, still smiling. Ray walked to the front, slower than he might have liked, but with certainty. He set a small velvet box on the lectern, opened it, and placed its contents beside Karen's packet of violation slips. The silver star gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "I've stood in worse rooms," Ray said, voice low but clear. "But not quieter ones." No one moved. Not even Karen. He turned and walked back to his seat, leaving the medal sitting alone at the center of the room. After a long pause, Karen picked up her folder. "Due to continued non-compliance, we'll be voting on a demolition motion next week." The words landed like frost on a windshield, quiet, hard, and final. The meeting ended without applause. Some people mumbled goodbyes. Others didn't meet Ray's eyes. Mark helped him down the steps of the community center while Walter walked ahead to the street cart just outside. They stood beside a painted hot dog stand, steam rising from the grill, mustard packets trembling in the breeze. Mark chewed silently, watching cars pass. "She can't be serious," he said finally. "She's dead serious," Walter replied, tearing the foil off his hot dog. "But she's made a mistake." Across the street, Ethan stood by the sidewalk, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He waved tentatively, then came over, kicking at a leaf as he looked up at Ray. "Why do you look so tired?" he asked. "It was just a meeting." The phone buzzed with a low voice. "This is Brigadier General Mason. Walter says you need a favor." "That's rare." Mark nearly dropped the receiver. He stood in the kitchen, framed by the golden late-afternoon light filtering through the dusty window panes. Outside, Ray was on the porch, sanding a piece of cedar beside Ethan, whose tiny hands mirrored every stroke like they were synchronized. "This is Mark Bell," he said after a beat, gripping the handset tighter. "I'll be at Willow Hills by noon," the voice replied. "Don't bother making a fuss. Your uncle never liked fuss." The line clicked off. At exactly 11:52 the next day, a dark blue sedan pulled up in front of the house. The passenger door opened slowly, and a man stepped out wearing a wool coat over a crisp tan uniform. His gait had softened with age, but he still moved like a man used to being watched. Mark stepped out to meet him, but Mason waved him aside gently. Ray was already standing at the edge of the porch, leaning slightly on his cane. His face didn't change, but his eyes lit just a little. "You never did like attention," Mason said, walking up the steps. Ray gave a small, weathered laugh. "You still order that awful rice sandwich?" Mason grinned. "You still hate small talk." They hugged, briefly, solidly. Mark had the impression it wasn't something they did often, or ever, but it fit somehow. Old timber doesn't need polish. They drove to the cafe near the train station, the one with cracked leather booths and laminated menus with faded corners. The place hadn't changed much since the 60s, judging by the decor, or the dust. Mason slid into the booth like he'd claimed it years ago. He ordered corned beef on rye, no mustard, and a black coffee. Mark asked for sweet tea. Their waitress, Darlene, embroidered name tag faded to just Dar, greeted Ray like he'd been in yesterday. On the wall behind them, a collage of veteran portraits spread from corner to corner. Mark spotted Ray's photo in the lower right, half faded, half obscured by a more recent headshot of someone in digital camo. "You know," Mason began, unwrapping his silverware, "some people think being a veteran is about medals. But real legacy is what comes after the parade." Mark nodded. "That's what we're trying to protect." Mason pulled out a folder from his coat. "Walter told me everything. Karen's been using the HOA's veteran-friendly status to apply for grant funding. Federal and state. Problem is, those designations come with strings, mainly transparency and proportional representation." He slid a page across the table. Clause 7b. Any HOA accepting public veteran-supportive funding must maintain public access to meeting records, financial reports, and community correspondence. Mark scanned it. She's been stonewalling everyone. I asked for minutes and got a pamphlet. That's a violation, Mason said, sipping his coffee. Might not end her, but it starts the unraveling. Back at the house later that afternoon, Mason and Ray sat on the porch in the creaking chairs that still bore the marks of summers long past. Ethan wandered by, holding his new carving, a pine turtle, a little lopsided but charming. Mason watched him go. "You've got a good apprentice there." Ray didn't reply immediately. He watched the boy disappear around the hedge, the same direction Mark used to vanish as a child. "I'm not doing this for me," Ray said finally. "I'm doing it so Ethan sees how to stand without raising a fist." Mason nodded. "Then let him see you stand." Ray turned slowly toward him. "Parade starts at 10. "I'll walk beside you," Mason said. "Bring the medal." From across the street, behind parted lace curtains, Mrs. Delaney watched the porch. Her rocking chair didn't move, but the window stayed open just a crack longer than usual. That evening, in a tidy office a few blocks away, Karen Whitmore put down her phone with a hand that trembled slightly. She walked to her calendar and drew a small circle around Veterans Day, then reached for another folder labeled Event Media Coordination, Priority. Her next call was to a public relations firm 3 counties over. Brigadier General Clay Mason was coming to Willow Hills. And that meant the optics had just changed. Veterans Day. Children wave flags. A swing band plays Glenn Miller's "In the Mood." Ray adjusts his jacket and nods at Ethan in the crowd. The morning air carried the bite of early frost, the kind that made breath visible and hands seek pockets. Folding chairs lined Willow Street, some already claimed with thermoses and wool blankets. Dogs in knitted sweaters padded alongside lawn signs that read "Honor." Remember. Celebrate. The scent of kettle corn and grilled sausages drifted in from the food trucks parked at the far end. Ray stood at the edge of the procession, shoulders squared beneath his tan coat. The silver star gleamed faintly against his chest, pinned neatly above his heart. Mason adjusted the brim of his cap and gave a short nod to the parade marshal, who signaled for the veterans to begin the march. The crowd rose gently to its feet. Applause began like a ripple, polite, then steadier, as townspeople recognized not just names, but faces. Some held hand-drawn posters. Others simply removed their caps. Ethan waved wildly from the third row, standing on a milk crate. "Mr. Ray," he called, holding a folded sheet of paper over his head. Ray didn't break stride, but he gave the boy a nod and the faintest smile. At the corner near the judge's booth, a local reporter with a wool scarf and windblown notepad turned to Mark. "You organized this?" Mark shook his head. "No. This is my uncle's day." The reporter scribbled anyway, glancing toward the front of the parade where Mason and Ray walked side by side, footsteps unhurried, like they'd walked longer and harder roads before. Near the main stage, Karen stood beside a portable podium, flanked by a banner hastily hung that read, "Willow Hills HOA, proudly supporting our veterans." Her blazer was immaculate. Her smile practiced. As Ray approached, she stepped forward with a microphone in hand. On behalf of the Willow Hills Homeowners Association, she began, "We are proud to recognize the service and sacrifice." Mason stopped, one boot just touching the edge of the platform. He held up a hand. "If I may." Karen hesitated, then handed the mic over with the kind of smile that bared teeth. Mason faced the crowd. His voice didn't need amplification, but the mic caught every word like the wind had stilled to listen. "Supporting veterans doesn't begin with banners or end with grant applications," he said. "It means standing behind them, especially when it's inconvenient. Not pushing them out under the guise of progress." There was a murmur, the kind that moves through a room when truth enters quietly and unapologetically. He reached into his coat and drew out the citation. The silver star glinted again in the sun as he held it up. Staff Sergeant Raymond Bell. "For gallantry and intrepidity in action, Republic of Vietnam, 1973. Who, while under sustained fire, extracted 2 wounded men from a disabled vehicle. Alone. Without hesitation. The crowd went still. Even the band stopped tuning. Karen shifted beside the stage, her smile tightening at the corners. Behind her, a man with an earpiece was on the phone, half concealed by a lemonade truck. Mason lowered the metal. "That's who lives in Willow Hills." Ray said nothing. He didn't need to. After the parade, children gathered around a small folding table where local veterans passed out tiny American flags and stickers. Ethan darted through the legs of taller folks and ran straight to Ray, breathless. "I made you something." He held up a crayon drawing. Ray, standing tall in uniform, with Ethan at his side, both under a hand-drawn banner that read, "Hero." Ray took the paper like it was a sacred thing. "You get better every time." Ethan beamed. "I'm gonna draw the porch next." Across the street, Mrs. Delaney stood on her porch, hand pressed to her chest. She nodded slowly when Ray glanced her way. As the crowd began to thin and folding chairs clattered back into trunks, a lone harmonica played taps near the food trucks. It was quiet, raw, and unexpectedly moving. Mark couldn't tell who played it. Maybe it didn't matter. The next morning, Mark stepped onto the porch with his coffee. The air was still cool, but softer now. A large white envelope leaned against the doorframe, unmarked, hand-delivered. He opened it slowly. Inside were internal HOA memos. Emails. Copies of Karen's grant reports. Every page stamped with the same phrase at the bottom, "Confidential, internal use only." Mark read the subject line on the top email and exhaled sharply. Subject: Adjust figures, ensure parade photos support veteran-friendly compliance. Remove mention of Bell residents. Karen's hands trembled as she flipped through the anonymous envelope, photocopies of her own grant applications, with forged veteran endorsement signatures. The HOA office was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that hummed with implication. The blinds were half drawn against the late morning sun, casting angled stripes across the table where Karen sat. Her fingers paused at the second page, where a signature, supposedly from Jim Collins, a veteran who'd moved out 2 years prior, sat beneath the phrase, "Community Veteran Endorsement." It was neat, almost too neat. Not his handwriting. Not even close. Karen swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. She flipped to the next page. Another endorsement. Another name she hadn't seen in months. Across town, Mark handed a second envelope, the original leak, to Walter inside the records room of Town Hall. The space smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Fluorescent lights flickered just enough to be annoying. Walter adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the top page silently. "Forged signatures," he murmured. "And these were submitted for state grants?" Mark nodded. 3 different filings. All flagged for veteran-friendly redevelopment initiatives. All attached to Karen's HOA leadership profile. Walter closed the folder and tapped it twice. The truth doesn't knock. It kicks. Later that afternoon, 2 HOA members knocked on Walter's office door. One held his hat in both hands. The other looked over his shoulder twice before stepping inside. "We didn't sign off on those filings," the first said. "We thought they were for landscaping upgrades. Not evictions." Walter didn't offer tea or small talk. He opened a legal pad and asked for names, dates, and anything else they remembered. By early evening, the town clerk confirmed what Walter suspected. "The signatures in these filings don't match our archived records," she said, flipping through birth certificates and voter cards. "Some of them are just made up." Back at Ray's porch, the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and something sweeter, cider, maybe, from the thermos Walter had brought. He and Ray sat in companionable silence, sipping quietly. The whittled eagle Ethan had given Ray sat on the railing between them, watching. "I filed the complaint," Walter said finally. "State Ethics Committee. They'll issue the hearing summons tomorrow." Ray nodded. Took longer than I thought. Justice usually does. Down the street, Mrs. Delaney crossed her yard with a plate covered in foil. She climbed Ray's steps slowly, carefully, like the words she carried were more fragile than her knees. I didn't speak up when they find your neighbor, she said, offering the plate. I won't stay silent again. Ray lifted the foil, cinnamon scones, still warm. He looked up at her, the weight of decades passing between them in one steady glance. No one's asking you to yell, he said. Just to stop whispering. She smiled then, and this one felt real. Ethan showed up just before the porch light flickered on. He had his backpack, a new carving poking out from the zipper. It looked like a star, still rough around the edges. My mom says you're the reason we stayed, he told Ray. Ray said nothing, but his hand rested lightly on the boy's shoulder for a moment before letting go. At 6:07 p.m., a courier delivered a white envelope to Karen's office. The seal on the front read State Committee for Public Ethics, Notice of Proceeding. She didn't open it right away. She sat at her desk, staring at the unopened letter, while her reflection in the dark window looked back, smiling, tightly, like always. Only this time, even she didn't believe it. That night, Ray placed the silver star back in its box. His fingers lingered for a moment on the edge before he closed the lid. He turned to Mark, who stood in the doorway, arms crossed. You'll do the talking, Ray said quietly. I've said enough. Now they'll listen to you. The courtroom-style hall was packed, neighbors with folded arms, notepads, and decades of withheld stories. The Civic Center still bore signs of its former life as a school auditorium. Rows of old theater chairs creaked under the weight of tension and anticipation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their glow dulled by time. Outside, the last leaves of autumn skittered across the pavement, but inside, the stillness was heavy and purposeful. Karen sat alone at the front table, her blazer immaculate, hair pinned just so, but her posture had changed. Gone was the breezy confidence. In its place, tight shoulders, fingers clasped too tightly. She looked smaller beneath the town seal that hung over the ethics panel's table, where 3 members sat with folded hands and serious eyes. General Mason stood near the side wall, arms crossed. Walter had his folders ready, arranged with near-military precision. Mark sat just behind the front row, next to Ray, who wore his usual flannel shirt and slacks, the silver star pinned discreetly to his chest. Karen rose when her name was called. There were miscommunications, she began, voice flat. Clerical errors. I relied on information provided to me by subcommittees. If there was a discrepancy, it was unintentional and not reflective of my dedication to this community. She sat quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Walter stood next. He presented the HOA citation timeline, aligning each cluster of violations with the grant submission dates. Every November, citations spike. Every December, a new grant application is filed citing veteran support compliance improvements. 12 properties. 9 owned by veterans. 5 sold under pressure. Mason followed, voice steady. Karen approached me last month to request a statement supporting her grant for veteran outreach. I declined. It didn't sit right, asking for support after evicting the very people she claimed to serve. A hush followed. Then Mark approached the lectern, a folder in his hand. I'd like to read testimony from 3 families no longer with us. Not because they moved away. Because they were moved out. He read each one, short, quiet recollections from the Millers, the Harrisons, and Jim Collins' daughter. Their words were simple. Tired. Grateful someone was finally listening. When he finished, the panel asked Karen if she wished to respond. She declined. The vote was quick. Unanimous. Karen Whitmore was officially removed from all HOA duties and barred from applying for or managing state-funded grants for 10 years. There was no applause, just the sound of 100 people breathing out at once. The panel turned to Ray. Mr. Bell, would you like to speak? Ray stood slowly, nodded once, then looked to Ethan, who sat with his sister near the back, their hands still stained with wood glue and crayon from a morning of porch crafts. He shook his head. The future talks better than I do. A quiet ripple of smiles moved through the crowd. A week later, the porch was alive again. Children gathered, not for carving lessons this time, but to listen. Ray sat in his usual chair, nodding along as Ethan read aloud from a picture book about national parks. Mrs. Delaney passed out slices of apple pie. Walter painted trim with two of the town's older teenagers. Even Mr. Harland, long aloof, had brought over a new flag for the mailbox. Mark stepped down the ladder and handed Ray a wooden plaque freshly mounted beside the porch steps. It read, "Willow Creek Veterans Welcome House. A place to honor, gather, and remember." Ray ran a hand over the engraved letters. "You did good," he said. Mark smiled. "We did it together." Inside, the kettle whistled. Mark poured 2 mugs of hot apple cider, handing one to Ray. They sat in silence, sipping slowly as the late afternoon light bathed the yard in gold. Across the street, a car rolled by, its windows tinted. Karen sat behind the wheel, expression unreadable, watching the porch she once tried to erase. She didn't stop. She didn't wave. Just passed silently, leaving the town she no longer owned behind. And on the porch, the kids laughed, the wind chimes stirred, and the old boards, newly sanded, freshly painted, creaked with life. On a quiet porch now filled with laughter and warmth, a once divided community has begun to mend, not through confrontation, but through remembrance and resolve. What started as silent compliance gave way to shared voices, and in standing together, neighbors rediscovered not just their rights, but their roots. The true power of a place doesn't lie in rules or paint colors, but in the people who refuse to let dignity be regulated away. Like a weathered porch light left on through the storm, one quiet act of courage can help an entire town find its way home. 40